Hello and welcome to Gaming History 101. My name is Sasha and I'll be your host today. Now, many people don't actually know that Nintendo made a 32-bit system. They just think they went straight from the Super Nintendo to the N64. Well, in terms of main console launches that went intentionally as they should, yes, that's true. However, Nintendo also made a 32-bit system that was meant to be a flagship, but never really took off, and as a result, it's basically just panned now. That system is the Virtual Boy. This isn't the box for the Virtual Boy, it's a game of the Virtual Boy, but you get the point. This system wasn't necessarily a home console, but it also necessarily wasn't a portable console. So what was it? The story of the Virtual Boy goes back much farther than just, oh, this person came up with X and decided to do Y with it. It goes back as far as the mid-80s. So strap on your seatbelts, this is going to be a multi-part episode, and let's talk about the history of the Virtual Boy. You might think this story starts in Japan sometime in the mid-90s at Nintendo HQ, but that's where you'd be wrong. This story actually begins at Cambridge University in 1985. Before the NES took off in America, a Cambridge engineer had a pretty good idea. This engineer's name was Alan Becker. Alan had the idea to stick a small, high-resolution display that was also very sharp in quality to a small personal computer that could be used on trains, planes, and anything that you wanted to. The main drag to this was battery drain. He wanted to make sure that the battery wouldn't be drained too much in order to be able to use it for prolonged periods of time. At that time, most portable displays were low-res, blocky, and usually in shades of gray or green. For example, the PowerBook 160, I think, had a, if I'm not mistaken, it had a gas plasma orange display that was like this big. And that's adding the assumption that most of them could handle graphics to begin with, and not just text. As I just said, these displays usually weren't that big, and on top of that, they usually weren't very legible in low light areas. If they tried to display any sort of motion or illusion of motion, there would be motion blur on the screen in the blue or black shade, similar to the original DMG Game Boy. Now, some of you might suggest, why not just use a CRT TV, kind of like, the iMac G3? Bad example, I know, this thing's like 20 years older than, what I'm talking about, but for the example it works. Well, if you actually take a look at this thing, the cathode ray tube in here is absolutely huge, and it wouldn't be very efficient to carry around something, the size of a large toy truck if you're just trying to, watch a VHS tape or whatever you would do in the car in the 90s. I don't know, I'm a Generation Z kid. On top of that, the only CRT displays that would be viable as something, small to carry around were being manufactured as viewfinders for those little portable cameras, and typically those weren't very sharp, and they weren't very power efficient, and they weren't very clear, and they were very small. If this video by Lazy Game Reviews is any indicator, then, that's all that needs to be said. If that didn't cement it for you, on top of that, the CRT format actually took up way too much battery life in order to do anything viable to preserve longevity of battery. The only option left in Alan's head is to use an LED display, which were cheap, efficient, and easy to come by. The only problem was finding an efficient way to incorporate it into his idea. Alan Becker's long history of working in the New England tech sector paid off very, very well here. For example, he worked with famous technologist Ray Kurzweil in 1974 at Kurzweil Computer Products. He was there to witness the invention of the first flatbed scanner. Their scanner was invented while developing a reading machine for the blind. It also made huge progress in the fields of optical image recognition and voice synthesis. It used 500 light-sensitive diodes all arranged in a line to sweep across a page, and then what it would scan would be reconstructed into a 2D image by a computer, similar to, your office jet scanning a picture and making a JPEG out of it. With this idea fit in his mind, Alan Becker conceived of a display that consisted of a single line of LEDs that print, quote-unquote, a persistent image onto a person's retina, and they did this by changing the pattern of lights that light up while sweeping across a given area. Kind of like one of those gas station open signs with the turning little blue lights. But instead of moving the LEDs themselves, he decided to have it move a reflection of the LEDs with a mirror that moved back and forth 50 times a second. He called his design the scanned linear array. On top of that, due to the nature of the LEDs, it could present a very bright, very high quality picture with a high resolution for a low cost should it have to be mass produced. Since he was a poor man like the rest of us folks, he looked around for anything that would be cost efficient and easy to put together. He found what he needed in an array manufactured by a company named AEG Telefunken, which was a German radio and TV manufacturing company. He decided to use red LEDs similar to the kinds that printers used at that time. It'd be an easy to find off-the-shelf part. However, this meant that Becker's display could only be displayed in a red on black background. The reason for this is that at the time, blue and green LEDs were way too dim and way too expensive to be used in any application like this. In around 6 months, Becker pieced together a prototype of the scanned linear array and picked up investment money from New England tech names like the aforementioned Ray Kurzweil and the director of the MIT Media Lab, Nicholas Negroponte, which gave the SLA instant tech credibility. In 1986, Alan Becker and Neil Golden, who was an experienced salesman, Benjamin Wells, who worked at Polaroid before his involvement with the project, and ex-Kurzweil engineer Nate Goldschlag, started a tech startup called Reflection Technology Inc., which was a reference to the usage of vibrating mirrors in the product. Neil Golden helped with the business plan, and Benjamin Wells was hired away from Polaroid as chief scientist. Nate Goldschlag was brought in as director of electronics. To fill out the roster, Becker hired a mechanical engineer named Greg Hunter, as well as an accountant who, unfortunately, I couldn't find the name of. The crew set up shop in the basement of a former bakery in Cambridge, which had retained its baked goods aroma. Steve Lipsey, the vice president of sales and marketing, later recalled that while working there, they could smell the baked goods and bread every single morning. The group worked together to miniaturize Becker's prototype. After a while, they came up with a 1-inch display that would simulate what a 12-inch display would look like if viewed from 18 inches away. They called it the private eye. Here's a picture of Alan Becker with the prototype of the private eye. Becker envisioned the private eye as a mobile, minimally distracting way to view documents privately. For example, Neil Golden and Steve Lipsey worked up sales literature where they would have a doctor wearing a private eye to find, the schematic of a human body and what they had to do, or a mechanic having like a blueprint here and having one eye open to actually do his work. Basically, imagine what the Kinect wanted to do for doctors. That's what the private eye wanted to do with showing MRI scans and stuff like that. And then airplane technicians would have like the schematics here, and they would actually be doing the work and fixing the landing gear, whatever was broken in the plane. Golden and Lipsey traveled the country making calls and giving live demonstrations to anyone who wanted to license the product. They wanted to market it mostly to medical and military purposes, as that seemed to be the most straightforward thing to do with the private eye. They also made contact with mom and pop shops who wanted to utilize the private eye as a display for a computer, and several of these were announced, but none of them ever came to market. Things weren't looking too good in terms of licensing and getting the product out to market. And then, when everything seemed to go downhill, they finally got their big break. This was at the Fall 1988 Computer Dealers Exhibition Show in Las Vegas. There, several technology publications picked the private eye as one of the must-see gadgets of that show that year, and it also garnered attention from prominent science magazines and write-ups, including a prominent feature in Popular Science and Popular Mechanics, and with that, garnered a huge new market of potential buyers. The tech media hailed the private eye as the future of heads-up displays and hailed it as something amazing and something that would lead them into the future. It also introduced the concept of virtual reality and augmented reality, and it was hailed as something like Google Glass. Remember that? Yeah, me neither. Reflection Technologies responded to all the buzz by saying that they would be selling dev kits for the private eye with a headband, a unit, and a computer interface board for $5,000 a piece. Lipsey says they sold about 75 to 100 of these, and that generated a lot of income for Reflection Technologies. Presentation was one thing, but another thing was actually selling the product. Lipsy says everywhere he went, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the project, but that's all it was, enthusiasm. Few firms actually went past the exploration stage. He would often encounter a sympathetic engineer who would champion the private eye to upper management, with excitement brewing for a while and eventually nothing coming out of it. Benjamin Wells says that the entire problem with the private eye is that they couldn't find a killer app for the display, and if you don't have a killer app, then what's the point of creating it? In the early 90s, virtual reality became a major buzzword in the American tech media. The term implies a simulated presence in a computer-generated world, one that can fool viewers into feeling like they're actually there. At that time, readers of tech magazines found themselves confronted with colorful images of headsets that enveloped users' field of vision. These headsets promised to transport them into fantastical worlds. Even NASA got into the game, funding its own VR research lab in 1990. The concept met an even wider audience thanks to the 1992 film Lawnmower Man, which objectively is a freaking awesome movie. It felt like the next step in technological evolution. Surrounded by that hype, around 1990, the engineers at Reflection put together a video game demo using 2 private eye units mounted to a welder's mask. They attached a primitive head tracking apparatus that monitored the movement of the wearer's head. The dual displays linked up to a luggable IBM PC-compatible computer that was running a tank sim. In the game, the player witnessed a first-person view from a tank window which looked out upon a desert terrain with pyramids. The goal was to shoot enemy tanks. It was incredible, recalls Lipsy. We played it all the time, and I'm not a video gamer. It was very psychologically powerful to put that thing on. Speaking of things psychologically powerful, while doing demo sales pitches to different people, Steve Lipsy actually spent an entire day with counterculture psychologist and drug advocate Timothy Leary at his house in North California. Steve later recalled that he was, of course, very interested in anything that would take you to another place. During that afternoon, Leary was very impressed by the tank game and said that it could possibly have been used as a replacement for LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs. This breakthrough convinced the firm to really push its technology towards the video gaming market, as they would find a bigger audience there for things like video games and, other computer experiences. Lipsy had spent a lot of time bussing himself between Massachusetts and Mattel HQ in California because engineers there were trying to figure out what they could do for, a toy or a video game with the private eye. They also talked to people from Hasbro, but in the end, neither firm made a decision on using the product or not. Despite the technological breakthrough that this headset brought into the early 90s, a lot of people were still very hesitant due to the drawbacks of the actual technology. Benjamin Wells later recalled, "The whole point of the tank demo was to demonstrate head tracking. As you turned your head to the right, what you saw moved by a corresponding amount. But if you introduced a perceptible delay between your head's movement and the view on screen, the display could induce motion sickness. If memory serves me, we were always on the too slow side of the vomit point. I don't recall anybody literally throwing up in the office, but I think we were lucky." And speaking of motion sickness and projectile vomiting, this is an issue that Oculus and other VR headset makers still deal with to this day. So I guess that proves as technology moves forward, solutions for motion sickness might not always move in the same direction. Others were apparently not so fortunate. Tom Kalinske, former president of Sega of America, recalls his encounter with the private eye while scouting out potential VR equipment for Sega's use. A big issue was that kids got sick, threw up, or just fell over while using it. We couldn't take that risk. But that also wasn't his only problem. As I recall, our problem with it was that it was just one color. We were already promoting Game Gear in all colors, and here he's referencing how the Game Gear was manufactured in, 13 different color variations. And I mean that literally. After being rejected by Mattel, Hasbro, and Sega, Steve Lipsy found contacts in Japan in 1991 through a man called Jack Plimpton. Jack was Reflection Technologies' contact for the region of Japan and that general area. In 1991, Steve Lipsy flew straight to Kyoto in order to meet with people from Nintendo Company Limited, who was Nintendo's parent company and managed all subsidiaries of Nintendo worldwide. At that time, Nintendo was the biggest video game company in the world, and on top of that, it was also probably one of the leading companies in terms of Japanese technology. Hiroshi Yamauchi's company basically owned the market, as they had something like 89% of market share in Japan, which was pretty good. Upon earlier inquiries from Plimpton, the private eye technology made it across the desk of engineer Gunpei Yokoi, who had joined Nintendo in 1965, way before video games were anywhere in the interest of Nintendo. He had been responsible for many interesting products over Nintendo's lifespan, and some of these were the Ultra Hand, the Game & Watch, and, little thing called the Game Boy. After the unexpected success of the Game & Watch line, which was entirely the responsibility of an unexpected calculator LCD boom in Japan, which made the screens ridiculously cheap. After this, Yokoi found an art in finding new uses for old technology, something he called lateral thinking of withered technology. Basically, if you can take something cheap, widely available, and easy to program for or use in general, and turn it into a product that is sensationally simple but fun, you can get rich quick. That's seriously oversimplifying the philosophy, but the point is essentially made. For example, the original DMG Game Boy. That was green and black, and it didn't have a backlight, and it only could display like 4 colors, but it still sold 118 million units, as opposed to the Game Gear, which only sold something like 10.82 million. The cost difference is one of the bigger factors. Steve Lipsy and Benjamin Wells displayed their technology to people at Nintendo. Wells later recalled an early trip to Nintendo in which he presented the private eye technology to a particularly eager employee. That employee ended up being Gunpei Yokoi. He was super excited about it, and he went on record and said that this is a really good product and that there's a system to be had here. The private eye came at a really interesting time for Gunpei Yokoi. His book, Yokoi Gunpei Gemukan, I'm sorry for butchering Japanese, or Gunpei Yokoi Game Pavilion, released with the help of Japanese author Takefumi Makino in 1997, he described feeling out of place in the gaming industry in the early 90s. He felt that the home console market kind of felt like an arms race of sorts, and that he felt that the manufacturers were more focused on bumping out the bigger numbers, the bigger graphics, the shinier, flashier sound, It was more of a dick-sized competition than anything else. He also felt that mainstream gaming was moving towards a more hardcore audience as opposed to, the casual audience, which is what made the Famicom and the Super Famicom blow up in the first place. These thoughts came at a key point at Yokoi's career because just before Reflection's visit, he was winding down from invention at Nintendo, and he was going to resign after 26 years because the invention side of Nintendo had grown way too bureaucratic for him. While he worked at Nintendo for 26 years, he racked up many successes, but he wanted a new challenge, and he laid out a plan to retire from Nintendo by age 50. After he would retire from Nintendo, he would form his own company where he would be able to control all invention processes by himself. But then, Reflection Technology came a-knockin'. If you liked this video, be sure to click up here in the cards to see the last 2 videos I uploaded on this channel, as well as my social media handles, and don't forget to subscribe and click that bell notification because then you'll be notified of every single new video that I upload, and probably every single video I like because I like a lot of videos on YouTube. Also, don't forget to comment what you want me to make a video on because if I like the idea, I'll be sure to make the video, and if I don't, well, it's not like I have a choice, do I? But, if this is all we part for today, this has been Gaming History 101. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.